But really, the main thing I wanted to do was sort of re-emphasize what it is we've been talking about and why we're trying to do it, what we've presented today. But I guess, first of all, it's important that I thank everyone that's still here and that have participated in this symposium today, because we really appreciate you for sticking with the topic, trying to understand it. Invasive plant management is very complicated. You can look across the landscape as you drive around Spokane, as you drive through the panhandle of Idaho and go south towards Oregon, and look at the landscape. And the landscape will speak for itself. It's clear when you look at the landscape that it's time for us to do something differently than what we've been doing for the last 50 or 60 years. What EBIPM is an attempt to try to move us from the idea of if we have weeds, we just need to kill them, to the notion of beginning to understand why we have them, what are the ecological causes for their invasion and their success, and then begin to tinker with the system, is the term you've been using, to manage the system so that the underlying reasons that the weeds are able to dominate is taken away from them, and we allow the plant community to shift back towards something that we consider useful, desirable, and provides the ecological goods and services that we are going to require for our next generations. In my view, it's a fundamental issue relative to preserving the natural resource base on which we all depend upon for our livelihoods, and it's our responsibility to pass on to the next generation those natural resources in as good as or better condition than the natural resources that we've received. And so here's an attempt for us to try to move away from what I think is more systematic responses to a much more comprehensive and science-based way of dealing with the problem that has a much higher likelihood of being successful. And that I appreciate you guys for sticking through it, because I know it's not as easy if I just told you a couple of prescriptions that might or might not work, and that you're going to go try them, and when you do try them, they might or might not. You might or might not get them put out right, and you might or might not get something going, and it might not work. To really deal with our complex natural resource issues, we're going to have to be more sophisticated in how we're thinking about it. It's not too sophisticated, because when you get down to the bottom line, it's really fairly simple, but it is going to require us to give it more thought than we have done in the past. So after sitting here all day for 7 or 8 hours, listening to EBIPM this, and EBIPM this, and EBIPM that, and EBIPM that, I'm going to give you a chance to listen to a little bit more of it. and about the 2.0 thing, you know, the whole 2.0 thing, it sort of reminds me of Vista. Remember Vista? But anyway, what I want to do is talk about and try to answer the question, okay, so I've sat through all of this, I've taken in all this information. The question now that I have for myself is, what do I do next, right? And so I have advice for what you do next. I have both personal advice and I have professional advice. Those of you who know me usually appreciate my personal advice, because I usually get to the heart of the matter when it comes to giving personal advice. And so the first slide here represents my personal advice to you after having spent grueling 7 or 8 hours in a meeting about EBIPM, where some things are contorted, some things are mathematical, some things are understandable, and most things are pretty confusing, but I'm thankful that there are books out there that I can go look at later. After having spent an entire day doing that, it's pretty clear to me that my personal advice for you is for you to find a way to rekindle your wits and begin to put your synapses back in order, and that's what I think is the appropriate thing to do. But after you've done that and you've gone home and you've thought to yourself, okay, what is it that I should do? And am I really going to try to use EBIPM? How do I get started? What do I need to think about? And what are the first initial steps that I should take? So you have all this bunch of information, and you're going to look at a bunch of books, and you're going to say, well, what really do I do? And that's really what I want to spend a couple of minutes on. It's not complex and it's not complicated, but a couple of minutes on just sort of saying, okay, after knowing this much, what should I do next? And so I have, so like heads, it's really pretty simple, and we're going to break this down, so don't worry about it. But all I'm suggesting is that you go to your maps and to your rangelands, and you look for 3 different conditions, right? One condition that says, I don't have any weeds. Another condition that you're looking for that's specific to identify is, I have about half weeds and half good plants. And then the third condition is, I have all weeds. So to start out, if you can just take your management system and break them into those three categories, you can start your EBIPM program based on that very simple interface. So we tell you to go out and do this real complicated assessment and really understand these 17 indicators and then figure out which successional processes are in disrepair. That's not the place to start. The place to start is in a much grosser level where you're trying to figure out what basically have I got out there and which of these types of management strategies that we've talked about should I think about applying to which of these conditions. So in this graph you have 3 different conditions. Each one of the different conditions has a different management focus, and we're going to talk about what you should try to do. The management focus goes, if you don't have any weeds, then we talked about WPAs and preventions and trying to keep that stuff weed-free. If you have a little bit of weeds and a little bit of good guys, then the management focus is trying to stress the weeds and try to give those plants that are already existing in the system a chance to gain vigor and to recover. And if you have nothing but weeds, it's much more complicated and it requires a much more comprehensive program. On the bottom graph, you can see that the priority level for your management and the likelihood of success is lowest the more complicated the system is, because the bang for the buck is much likely less. And that the priority and the likelihood of success is highest where you have the most intact type of system. So this little graph is someplace for you to think about starting, but what I want to do is sort of reinforce the ideas that are in it and possibly end with trying to see if we can find a way to make this show how you can integrate the EBIPM into your management decisions. So this is the system that we're working in this case. It's of no infestation. You see, there aren't many annual grasses, or none. And so we're going to use Corey's strategies, and we're going to implement WPAs in those systems. I always say that what I think is really a problem with our invasive plant management funding sources and how we allocate resources is that the highest priority and the most likely successful area that you're going to be able to influence are those areas that don't yet have weeds. But and 98% of your resources ought to be spent keeping those from getting weeds. But when you look at people's management budgets, 98% go to this hard infestation where they're probably not having a lot of success, but they keep spending money there over and over again. And in the meantime, the invasive plants are all screaming around that little area where they're spending all the money, taking over new areas. 98% of the resources, in most cases, are spent keeping the areas free of weeds from getting them. And that's really what needs to happen. And that's the highest and top priority. And developing weed prevention areas where folks get together, identify the problems, and create objectives for themselves and work together to keep these areas free of weeds is the most essential and the biggest thing that EBIPM stresses and can offer to you. We've all seen, I'm just reiterating what Corey said, so I'm giving him credit, you know, we need to use these types of prevention programs to keep these weeds from continuing to expand, and it's the most reasonable thing we can do. One of the things that really needs to be stressed with weed prevention areas, though, is that weeds are a biological problem, but they're only half a biology and management problem. The other half is a people problem. And really, the WPA is a half people-oriented solution and half a biology management solution. And it has to be that way because it's the people that have to really take the action and get things going. And then the 5 steps that Corey talked about are all important in any WPA type of program. So those, I think, are critical. That's the way when you go out to your landscape and you see you don't have many infestations, you're going to have a prevention, you're going to try to protect the uninfested areas. The WPA and the prevention programs are what you should just spend a massive amount of consideration and prioritization on as far as EBIPM is concerned. The next area is if we have moderate infestations, but we still have a fairly reasonable representation of the plant community still intact, which means we still have species that we can encourage. We can help them produce more seeds and produce more vegetative reproductive parts, we can get them to grow and begin to take over the system again. We don't have to do a full-fledged restoration program. But EBIPM is still very essential. The idea here is that you have an area that has half and half. You can see some components of desired perennial grasses, but you can see lots of invasive annual grasses. Once we assess this site, then we can begin to get the data that tells us which ecological processes are in disrepair for this system. They're not all going to be in disrepair because you know that you have some things that are still operating because you still have some species that are intact and important components of the final desired system you'd like to have. So when you assess this, what you're going to find in your assessment is that there's still some good things happening out there. It's not completely trashed, and that you really need to be careful to identify the few things that really need to be repaired and focus your efforts on repairing those things and not inadvertently, that keeps you from inadvertently trying to adjust particular parts of the system and the processes that really don't need to be repaired. So we fall back to the entire EBIPM 5-step process for this. We assess it, we determine which few of these processes seem to be the dominant processes that are in need of repair. There's likely not too many in this case because we have a reasonably, we still have a partially functioning system. We associate which principles, the P cubed we called it, which principles apply to those, and then you develop which tools and strategies that you're going to use. So it's the same thing that we've done all the time. We look at the processes associated with each of the causes of succession. These are the causes, these are the processes, and we try to identify which one's the dominant. In this case, we're going to claim that stress is probably the dominant. What we'd really like to do is try to see if we can use the process of stress to apply to the two principles that we talked about earlier. We're going to apply stress to the invasive, and we're going to remove stress from the desired species because they still exist here. And so in my program, I'm into the grazing because I think it offers a huge opportunity for us to both make money and use the resource, as well as try to use it to shift the community direction, because you can apply stress by using animals to put pressure on the invasive species, and you can also time your stress program so that it minimizes or reduces stress on the establishing or on plants. Those of you who saw the green and brown program know that we're trying to avoid stressing the desired species, and I think that we can shift plant communities simply that have annual grasses especially, simply using this. There's also opportunities for you to use selective herbicides that allow you to stress the weed and also give a chance for the desired species to take advantage of that system. So in a system where we're primarily interested in trying to shift the balance of the species that are already out there, using grazing animals or herbicides as stressor, and address the principle of the process of stress by making sure that we stress the plants that we don't like and remove stress from the plants that we do like, is really a viable, economically viable and reasonable way for you to approach it. And finally then, once we get that EBIPM program put together, then we can begin to consider, now to me this is I would like to contain these types of infestations that are completely trashed with weed and they don't have anything else. I would like to contain them while I'm doing these other things, but I tend not to want to do anything like this until I've got everything else in place and I'm fully satisfied that I'm protecting the uninfested land. And I'm also, because this is less risky and a bigger bang for the buck, I'm going to spend a lot of time dealing with this land. And then once I get all that done and everything's in place, I'm feeling really good about it. I think I rock, and you know, I'm thinking, okay, we can start now thinking about what we're going to do with this because it's risky and it's expensive. Okay, and so the same kind of idea goes with that. We have an area here. This used to be nothing but sagebrush, and you can tell we've done some restoration in here. It was nothing but, it had some sagebrush and bare ground and cheatgrass and weeds. And then we used this flow chart here where we began to become very specific about the understanding the rangeland health assessment for this particular site. We assessed it hard, tried to understand it, and then begin to develop EBIPM programs for it. And I know this looks very similar, but what you're going to find is this is going to be a different program, because when you go out in assessment, you're going to find all three of these causes are probably a problem. Most of these processes are probably in disrepair, because this system is so dysfunctional at this point because it doesn't have any representation of the desired species. And most of these principles and tools are probably going to need to be considered somehow or another. So it's a much more comprehensive program. We're using the same 5-step program, and what makes this program going to be designed differently than the previous one, where we had some desired species, is that the processes that we identify that are in disrepair aren't going to be the same ones. It's going to be much more complicated in this system. And to deal with it is going to be much more difficult and risky. So we go through the same process of trying to understand the causes and their associated processes. And then we use the principles. And I only chose one example in this case that made most sense. But you would have to go through this and consider each of these different processes. But I do know resource acquisition is a big deal in these systems, and you're going to have to figure out a way to lower the nutrient level, and then you're going to have to seed with species that maximize niche occupation. And so from a practice standpoint, we're going to disc it, and then we're going to use a cover crop, and then we're going to come up with this desired seed mix. We're probably going to seed it multiple times. If you went through the other processes, it would tell you to try to seed it multiple times by maximizing the chance that the seed reaches a safe site. It's going to be it's going to talk about how you're going to graze it differently, how you're going to do different things. It's going to be a very comprehensive system. It's going to be that system that we talked about earlier. It's going to be, look, I'm going to have to do this and this to address this. I'm going to have to drill seed. I'm going to have to use a diverse seed mix. I'm going to probably have to spray it. I'm going to have to do all of these things. This system that we designed earlier today is really a system that's for a completely degraded situation. Not all situations are that way. In fact, there's still a lot out there that we can capture and prioritize that aren't so disturbed and so trashed that we have to do this comprehensive thing. I had a question earlier about, well, how can we afford to do this stuff? But when you really look at what you're really asking yourself to do, there's a really good chance that this is a 2 or 3 entry process. The cost is probably $150 an acre, to be honest with you, and maybe 100 if you got lucky. The probability of success is probably 66% if you use this type of system, if you thought through this model. And so it's really expensive, it's really risky. And really what you want to do is prioritize the uninfested areas and the marginally infested areas first, and then start gambling on this, and that's the way this stuff works. So in my view, then, EBIPM offers opportunities for us to think through management, for us to then use the fundamental science that we have developed and we've compiled in the form of these principles. Jeremy was largely responsible for doing this, and what he's done and what we've done is taken the entire suite of literature of all of these publications and all of this information, and we squeezed and pushed and squeezed and pushed, and we come up with this series of rules of thumb. And the rules of thumb are really things that you can use to help you guide the choice of management based upon what processes actually seem to be in disrepair. It's my view that if you're interested in trying to preserve the natural resources for future generations, the idea that we've been able to move from being successful 1/12 of the time to 2/3 of the time is a huge improvement in how we're dealing with invasive species. And I think it gives us a beginning opportunity to actually implement invasive species management programs that have a likelihood of preserving our natural resource base for future generations. I hope you'll be excited about using it. I hope you'll think about splitting it up and not making it overwhelming for yourself, like you got to go do rangeland health assessment everywhere or whatever. Just look at your map, get some general ideas of what 3 of these conditions you have, and then start working through them based upon this prioritization that we've talked about on how to approach it. And that should be a fairly simple, straightforward way for you to begin to enter into how using EBIPM to develop management strategies that can be successful for you. And of course, we try to provide as much support as we can. We offer the website at ebipm.org and all of that material back there. We're really interested in getting some case studies and some programs going across the landscape so that we can actually move from what I consider the 1960s and move on into the 2000s with our invasive plant management and really integrate and incorporate science into the decision on how we choose what we're going to do and what we're not going to do. So with that, thank you all very much for attending this symposium. We really appreciated the excitement that we had here and your participation. I appreciated all the people that's been working across the West and dealing with the EBIPM program. And I sincerely appreciate you all for attending this symposium. Thank you all very much.